procurement process, buying things. I think it's a logical place for us to start because every organization, I can't imagine one that this would not fall into this category. Every organization buys stuff. Technically, an organization may not make anything, and technically an organization might not sell anything, but even charities buy stuff. And so the procurement process is a very universal process in business. Now, on the most fundamental level, it's not a process that has a lot of distinct elements to it. Where the part of our discussion will really focus is on some of the details in these individual steps and then different ways these could play out in an organization. But we have observed previously that the trigger for the procurement process is the creation of a purchase requisition, and then ultimately that purchase requisition will be turned into a purchase order, which will be sent to a vendor. At some point after that, we'll get the materials in that we ordered, and then at some point, either before or after the materials arrive, we will get an invoice, and then for some reason, our suppliers actually expect them to pay us, or actually expect us to pay them, and so we send payment at the end. This process is often alternately referred to as the order to cash process, or excuse me, no. This is the procure to pay process, beginning with the initial element of procurement and culminating with our paying, and you will further sometimes see that abbreviated as P2P, procure to pay. So some organizations I've worked with, they love their acronyms, and so they'll just refer to this as the P2P process and assume that you know what they are talking about, where others will call it the purchasing process or the procurement process or whatever have you. I would caution you that although nothing on this slide is inherently wrong, it is not necessarily a given that it's just the warehouse that's going to be creating purchasing requisitions. Certainly people that work in the warehouse can do so, but an executive could create a purchase requisition if he or she needs a new laptop, for example. The other references to functional areas in the organization are pretty standard. The purchasing department's going to take care of the purchase orders. The people in the warehouse are likely going to receive the materials and so on. But I always have thought that this kind of reference specifically to the warehouse here is at least potentially misleading. So don't let that trip you up. Realize that really anyone in an organization could be authorized to create a purchase requisition. So what we are going to talk about is we're going to look at and talk about the organizational levels that come into play in procurement and what their particular role is. And realize the reason why this is important is because so much of our reporting, so much of our data capture, and then our ultimate reporting is going to focus around these organizational levels. These organizational levels also carry with them, if you will, in a lot of cases, issues related to authority, which is a way of us having control within our organization. Control is one of those words that sometimes when you hear, you kind of bristle in response because we tend to not like to think about control. But in an organization that has standardized business processes and wants to be disciplined about what they do, having a modicum of control is very, very important in the organization. Organizational levels allow us to do that. We will talk about master data relevant to procurement. We'll talk about just some foundational concepts of the process, and then ultimately we'll work through the steps in the process in depth. I am quite sure that we will start into this, but not be done with this before the midterm exam. So as I mentioned before, the midterm exam will just kind of get chopped off at the point that we have covered, and then your final exam, I'll go ahead and mention, because for sure someone will ask me this, the final exam is cumulative, but it will primarily focus on the things from the second half of the semester. So this chapter will kind of span partly midterm and partly focused on the final exam. What are the organizational levels relevant to procurement? I have to say that it's kind of interesting grading homework assignments. And this has been a very busy week for me this week, and so I do not have all of your homework assignments graded, but I have started grading your most recent question set. And this question is one that has cost some of you some points, because your book rightly observes that there are 6 organizational levels, and it puts 3 of them together, and then it goes on and introduces the other 3. And a lot of you listed the first 3 and didn't list the second 3 because of the odd way that your book kind of presents that. So as we're talking about this, make sure that you pick up on how this might be different from what you wrote down in the context of your answers to your homework questions. The client is an organizational level relevant to procurement. Every process we talk about this semester, we will observe that the client is relevant. The client is our organization at its highest level of aggregation. Everything happens in terms of the client, as illustrated by the fact that when we log into the system, we log into the client. So the client is relevant to the procurement process. The company code is relevant to the procurement process. Why is the company code relevant to the procurement process? Yes, sir. Financial accounting, very good. Does procurement have a financial accounting implication? Yes. Company code, therefore, is relevant to procurement. Plants are relevant to procurement. Now, plants are relevant to procurement really in 2 different ways. Remember that the generic definition of a plant is a place where goods and or services are created, stored, or dispersed. So what we call a distribution center would typically be classified as a plant. What we might call a warehouse would perhaps be classified as a plant. So if we think of a plant as being a place where things are made, then the activities of a plant will generate the needs for raw materials and perhaps semi-finished goods and supplies and things of that sort. So the plant is relevant there. But also, we're going to need a place for stuff to be delivered to and received and stored. And that's another facet of the plant. So once again, what we generically call a plant in our ERP system could be a building with a smokestack and lots of manufacturing equipment in it, or it could just be a building with a lot of truck bays and storage racks. So both of those kinds of scenarios are relevant to us in procurement. Storage locations, very, very relevant for us in procurement, because when we buy stuff, we've got to put it somewhere, okay? Now notice the 3 different things that come into play when we think about storage locations. We have product characteristics, we have material type, and we have stock status. So in a given organization, we can have as many or as few storage locations as we want. You know, we could, for example, build a giant building and call that entire building just one storage location and call it universal storage, and everything goes in there. Well, good luck finding stuff. And good luck having a method of organizing things. You know, typically we have a larger facility and it might be broken down into different segments. A long time ago, I did some work in the commercial food service industry. And I can recall one time visiting a very, very large produce distributor. Sold fruits and vegetables and things like that. And big facility, probably had an indoor facility larger than a football field. And what I really found fascinating when I toured their facilities is they took me, and the whole facility was broken up into different rooms that you could walk through. And they had dry goods storage that was just things at room temperature. And as I recall, stored in that were things like I think bananas and avocados and some things like that were stored there. I think potatoes go there. Then they had another room. They had a set of refrigerators. And the refrigerators were at different degrees of coldness because some fruits and vegetables like it colder than others. But the one thing that I found surprising is I understood the temperature difference, but different fruits and vegetables like different levels of humidity. And of course, if you're a distributor, you want to maximize the freshness and the quality of your goods. So as I recall, they took me into one room that seemed basically like you were walking into your refrigerator at home. It was cold, but other than it being cold, there was nothing notable about that. And then we walked from that room to another room, and immediately when you walked in, you felt it was wetter. And as I recall, the first room had like a relative humidity of 20%, and then the next room we walked into had a relative humidity of 40%. Well, then we walked into another room that they kind of affectionately called the wet room. And I don't know if you could imagine walking into a room where it's like walking into a cloud in a refrigerator. I mean, the moisture just hung in the air like a cloud. And if you stood there for more than 30 seconds, you were soaking wet because there was just so much moisture in the air. And they had certain fruits and vegetables stored there that like that kind of high humidity environment. Well, the idea here is we might need to store things in different locations based on product characteristics. And so we might have, dry refrigerated storage and wet refrigerated storage and low humidity refrigerated storage or whatever have you. Or we could be looking at things like we have radioactive material, okay? Now, as a point of clarification, they were not selling any radioactive materials at the produce distributor that I went to. But you could imagine that if they were a produce distributor / radioactive material distributor, you probably wouldn't want the bananas sitting next to the radioactive isotopes, You want to keep those things separate. There's a lot of things that next time you go to a grocery store, maybe notice this, you will always find well, always is maybe too strong a word, but next time you go to the grocery store, find the aisle that has the laundry detergent and stuff in it. And then notice that next to that is very likely to be the aisle for like paper towels and Kleenex and stuff like that. They have to be very, very careful what they put in proximity to the laundry detergents because the laundry detergents have a really, really strong odor. If the next aisle over from the laundry detergent was cereals, your Frosted Flakes would taste like, dishwashing liquid, which probably would not be palatable for you. So when they lay out the store, they have to give a lot of thought to, where are we going to put the stuff that stinks and how can we keep it away from the stuff that's apt to pick up the smell. That's why you'll never see fresh produce and things that really, really stink, like cleaning chemicals, close to one another in a store. Well, we have to give attention to those kinds of things in laying out our storage facility as well. So we might have to have different storage locations to account for just variances in the characteristics of the products. Now, in your lab work, we've made this really simple. And in fact, your storage locations are based largely on material types. What are material types? Well, we've talked about this before, but remember, material types are things like raw materials and finished goods and trading goods and things of that sort. And if you've worked through your lab work at this point, you might already realize you have a storage location called trading goods, and you have a storage location called finished goods, and a storage location for raw materials. And so in your organization that you're setting up, they've differentiated it primarily on material type. But we could have trading goods, some that need to be refrigerated, some that need to be frozen, and some that don't. So we might have multiple storage locations that are primarily based partly on product characteristics and partly on material type. We may also have storage locations based on stock status, and we'll say more about this, but this would, for example, be we might, when we buy things, inspect those things before we actually put them in inventory. Maybe, for example, it's a perishable material, and we want to go through and make sure it's of appropriate quality. So we might have a storage location designated for things that are in inspection. And then once those things are cleared from the inspection station, they might be moved to a different location. So we might have a room for things in inspection. We might have a room for things that have been rejected. And these are things, we've got to put them somewhere until the truck comes to pick them back up. And so there's lots of different ways we could segregate and divide up storage locations, but these are the three things that we tend to focus on in making those kinds of decisions. And so the idea here is that the way we represent this in our ERP system is consistent with our needs as an organization. I have seen places before where it's one large room, but there's like colored tape on the floor that just breaks things up into different regions. And we could consider the area bounded by that colored tape to be different storage locations. There's nothing that says there has to be physical walls separating it. That can be the case, or these can just be logical differentiations of floor space. But this is going to be very, very critical for us because we're going to do a lot of our inventory and a lot of our financial accounting based on being able to say what is in what location. And so most organizations are going to be very, very particular about putting things where they're expected to be. Because if you've ever worked in an organization where you move a lot of materials, you know that if at any point something gets put where it's not supposed to be, it may just disappear at that point, or you may lose track of it. So this is something where organizations will typically try to exert a fair amount of discipline. Another organizational level relevant to procurement is the purchasing organization. Now remember, we have purchasing organization and purchasing group. And purchasing organization handles our purchasing activities from a strategic perspective. So they are the ones that are primarily going to be out identifying and selecting vendors. One of the real misnomers that a lot of people that don't know a lot about business have is thinking that it's very, very easy to find the stuff you need to operate your company. And I will admit that now, thanks to things like the internet and the World Wide Web, it's much easier than it used to be before those tools were available. But a lot of organizations have found a key to their success to be lining up a vendor that can provide them with a unique raw material that no one else has. Where I used to live in Florida, I knew a gentleman who decided to start a coffee company and kind of go in competition with Starbucks. And in our particular town, he does far, far more business than Starbucks does. And the whole key to it was, one year he was on vacation in Israel and found a coffee bean farm in Israel. And they grew some kind of bean that is not very typical. And he struck up a relationship with the owner of that, I don't know what you call it, orchard or vineyard or coffee farm or whatever have you. And he negotiated a deal with them that would allow him to be the only person that could sell their beans on like the eastern coast of the United States. And they forged that contract, and he came back home and started a coffee company, and he started selling coffee where he would roast their beans and he would sell, the ability to make your own coffee at home, or he sold it there at his coffee shop. And I'm not a coffee drinker, but apparently it's like the world's best coffee, and everybody just loves his coffee. And his success as a business was because he found a supplier that now nobody else can use. Snapple used to run these commercials about, and they were kind of tongue-in-cheek about it, about, we were always made with the best stuff. Well, now the best stuff just got better because they put a lot of effort into finding farmers that'll grow particular herbs and spices and aromatics and things to their specification, and that's a key to their success. So a lot of companies will pay people literally to travel around the world and find suppliers that can outfit them with products to help drive their success. Seems like a pretty good job to me. That would be the role of someone working in a purchasing organization. They identify, they select vendors, they negotiate conditions, they negotiate contracts, they set pricing conditions, they handle the strategic dimension of our purchasing. So obviously, they're an organizational element or an organization level relevant to procurement. And then we have the purchasing group. Probably a slightly less glamorous job. These are the people that are actually going to do the buying. So, hypothetically, the purchasing organization are the people that fly all around the world and visit the vendors and tour factories and negotiate contracts. And then the people in the purchasing group sit at the company headquarters and pump out purchase orders. Slightly less glamorous, but an equally important part of the process. And so we have the ability to segregate strategic purchasing from purchasing execution through these two organizational levels, or these two organizational elements. So let's dig into a few of these in a little bit more detail. I don't think we need to say much more about client. We've kind of driven the company code and financial accounting into the ground at this point, although we'll come back to it a little bit later in this chapter. Plant, there's not as much to say about, and storage location either. But purchasing organization, companies do some different things here. We have a lot of flexibility. And what I'll do here is we'll kind of talk about this in terms of text, and then I'll draw some pictures to illustrate this on the next slide. So one of the ways that we could handle purchasing in our organization is we could have an enterprise level purchasing organization. So if you will, this is going to correspond to something that's at the client level. So we would have the ability in an enterprise level purchasing organization to negotiate contracts and engage in purchasing strategic activities for many, many company codes. Now, of course, they all have to be company codes in the same client, but they can be multiple company codes. Why would you want to do this? What's the merit of an enterprise level purchasing organization? Centralization, why is that a benefit? What's that? Quantities. We may be able to consolidate our buying and thereby reap benefits. I don't know if any of you grew up in an area, maybe some of you are here local or maybe from other places, but in some regions of the country, in this country many years ago, you used to see stores that as part of their name had IGA. Well, IGA stood for the Independent Grocers Association. And the idea was that if you wanted to open a grocery store, you could do so and be independent, but you realized that there was merit in this idea of being able to purchase in large volume. So the Independent Grocers Association provided a structure whereby independent grocers could band together and purchase communally in order to command better prices from suppliers. So an IGA store, let's just assume we're talking about this area, there might be an IGA store in Johnson City, and one in Gray, and one in Gate City, and one in Kingsport, and they weren't direct competitors with one another, but they would kind of all band together and go out and negotiate with, I don't know, a paper towel company, and use that to get really good prices. And so they would have maybe one distribution center that the paper towel company would deliver to, and they would all pull their supplies from there. And the idea was they could negotiate better prices, offer their customers better prices, and since they weren't direct competitors, it made good sense. Well, that's parallel to what we're talking about here. Even though we're talking about distinct company codes, and hypothetically those company codes might be in competition with one another, there's still this idea that if we can use this as a vehicle to get better prices, then that's in everyone's best interest. So the enterprise level purchasing organization, or it's also called the cross company code purchasing organization because it can represent multiple company codes, is the ability to manage purchasing strategically, as was mentioned, in the most centralized manner. Option number 2 is company level purchasing organization, also called cross-plant purchasing organization for reasons that we will develop here. And so the idea is this purchasing organization buys just for a single company code. But given that a single company code can have many, many plants, it can buy for many plants that are all associated with the same company code. So in this structure, the purchasing organization is assigned to a company code and therefore can potentially engage in strategic purchasing operations for many, many different plants. At the other end of the spectrum is a plant-level purchasing organization, otherwise known as just a plant-specific purchasing organization. This purchasing organization, still we're talking about the strategic facet of buying, but only for a single plant. And so the purchasing organization is actually assigned to the plant. So what you're seeing here is assigned to the client level, assigned to the company code level, or assigned to the plant level. And so while the top one is the most centralized, the bottom one here is the most decentralized. Now, the other thing to add into the mix here is there's nothing that says we have to just pick one of these. And so in many organizations, you'll see, excuse me, I should be more precise, in many clients, in many conglomerates, you'll see multiple purchasing organizations, each with their own kind of focus and area of responsibility, and with different spans of control or spans of influence in the overall structure here. So we have enterprise level, company code level, and plant level. And this is all, you know, this was in your book, and this is something you read through, and the facts are pretty easy to understand. You know, let's kind of work through, though, why this is something useful. Yes, sir?
I know there's the question in the homework that was talking about kind of these 3 examples and like when they would be appropriate to use. I was just kind of curious about my answers. What the way I thought of it was as something like an enterprise level purchase organization. I thought of it as, for example, it was a company that was only localized to the United States.
Okay.
Maybe they would use an enterprise level, maybe because I thought of it in terms of currency.
Okay.
As opposed to a company that might use a company level if they have different plants or different distribution centers in different countries. So you would have different purchasing organizations for different currencies, I guess.
That could work. I mean, the key is really, it's all about a company being able to have a strategy, and then the system being able to support them operationalizing their strategy. So what you have just proposed sounds to me like a strategy, and this structure would allow you to operationalize this. So yeah, that's absolutely valid. Yeah. And the diagram I'm drawing here, let's talk through some other ones here and see if any of you have any, you know, kind of any other thoughts here. So here's my scenario. We have a client that, just for the sake of keeping this simple here, has 3 company codes in it, company code 1, 2, and 3. And as I am in the process of drawing now, the company codes each have a plant, but we can see they have a variable number of plants. And so we have multiple plants designated as plant 1, but they're associated with different company codes. Okay, so the idea here is the enterprise level would mean that would be this guy right here. And generally speaking, the reason why we would have enterprise level is maybe we're a really simple organization. And so it's not even as complex as my drawing here. And so we could get away with one just due to the size of our organization. But if we're an organization that's large, the reason why the enterprise level might be of use for us is exactly what we've been talking about here, because it's going to enable us to wield more clout in the marketplace. And we can go to suppliers and say, hey, I'm here negotiating on behalf of, and we can now name drop several companies and talk about our purchasing in terms of the activity of all of those companies aggregated together, and potentially get a lot more interest on the part of a supplier. Now let's jump to the other extreme. We said that you could have a purchasing organization just associated with a single plant. So here's my question for you. Clearly, that's probably not going to be driven by the idea of trying to leverage high volume purchasing. You know, the high volume purchasing would be more typically associated with enterprise level. So why would we want a plant level purchasing organization? Yes, sir.
For the specific location, maybe there's some demographic attributes that may be beneficial for you, that people within that purchasing organization to know, customs or something like that, has a better bargain that way.
Excellent. And in fact, depending upon our industry, you undoubtedly have picked up on the fact that a huge thing in some industries now is things like buying local and having locally sourced materials and whatever have you. Well, maybe all of the plants on this diagram are on the West Coast except for Plant 2. And Plant 2 is located here in the good old state of Tennessee. And so Plant 2 wants to do a lot of its buying here in Tennessee. A lot of people don't realize this, but in the last couple of years here in Kingsport, Eastman Chemical built a huge new world headquarters. I don't know if you've driven by it. It's a big old place, looks like a giant glass something. I don't know what shape it is, but a big old piece of glass out there that a lot of people work in. Well, when they started building that building, they said, as much as we possibly can, we want to buy local. So all of the glass in that building was made by companies within less than 100 miles from that facility. And a lot of the other things in that building, if they could find a local supplier, they went with that local supplier. Even if there were suppliers in other parts of the country that would have been cheaper, they viewed it as, we're contributing to the local economy, we're putting money back here into Kingsport, and that'll be good for this area. So that was a particular strategy that they had. Well, that could be what we're trying to achieve here. Maybe because we have a plant in a given location, we really want to work hard to source materials for that plant from that location. And so we might want to have a purchasing organization that would have that kind of geographic focus around where the plant is. I'm not saying that's the only reason we would do it, but I'm saying that's a reason we might want this. We want a purchasing organization that can particularly hone in on a given locale. Anybody think of any other reasons that might make sense for viewing this on a plant level? Excellent. You know, maybe, for example, and there's two different ways this could play out. Either Plant 2 here has really, really old equipment, or Plant 2 has really, really new equipment. And nonetheless, it's distinct from all the other plants. And so they need stuff that the other plants don't. So that being the case, we wouldn't really want to tax the enterprise level purchasing organization with something that's only going to be used by one facet of the organization. There's no benefit to be had there from the aggregation because no one else needs it. So a purchasing organization that is much more intimately aware of what's going on in that particular plant can make sure they locate the resources that are particularly needed by that plant. So going back to one of the things I mentioned, this is why in our organization, there's merit to having an enterprise level one and merit to having a plant level one. And so we can have both. It kind of gives us the ability to have the best of both worlds. We could group together all of the buying for a particular company code and span across plants. And here the argument is pretty similar. Maybe all of those plants involved in what I just circled have needs that are very much in common, but yet are distinct from the rest of the organization. So we can't really handle their needs on an enterprise level, but we can handle it in terms of thinking cross-company. So the ability to kind of mix and match in how we create these structures gives us a lot of flexibility in our organization. There's one other thing that can come into play here, and that is what a lot of organizations will do is they will create what's called a reference purchasing organization. And if you will, this could perhaps be viewed as the master or highest level purchasing organization. And so this purchasing organization, which is typically enterprise level, is the one that may negotiate contracts and then actually pass those contracts down to other purchasing organizations. You know, so the idea would be something like this. We have a reference purchasing organization that we designate as RP01. And maybe they only negotiate really, really, really big contracts. So in a given year, all of their work might be focused on just kind of 4 different materials. And so they go out and they conduct negotiation and contracting for just a limited set of things. And then once they finish their work, they kind of pass their work product on to other purchasing organizations to follow up on that and flesh out the particulars. So here hypothetically you have purchasing organization P999, which appears to be company code level because it spans across multiple plants. And so in its work, it might reference things. It's kind of akin to saying, okay, you know, call a company on the phone and say, you were just talking with this other part of our organization. We're now here to kind of follow up on that and advance the contract even further. So they're kind of handling things on a very, very high level at the highest level of our organization, and then other purchasing organizations might leverage their work. So this is something that you will see in some organizations as well. It's just kind of a special case of an enterprise level purchasing organization. Well, this looks like a good place for us to stop for today. Any questions or anything before we head out?